Mary Collins' hands trembled as she stared at the hospital bill in front of her. The yellowed paper seemed to mock her with absurd numbers she could barely comprehend. But she understood enough. Her mother's life depended on that money. $50,000. An impossible sum for someone like Mary, a college student struggling to balance her studies and a part-time job as a waitress at a local cafe. Mary's life had never been easy, but she always had Grace by her side. Her mother was her rock, her biggest supporter, and the only family she had left. Grace, a strong-spirited woman, was now frail, battling aggressive cancer. The health insurance had denied coverage for treatment, and every door Mary knocked on seemed to slam shut faster than she could plead her case. It was a cold winter night when Mary, desperate and out of options, found herself at a charity gala. The event was invite-only for high-profile guests, but Mary had a simple plan: beg. Dressed in a borrowed gown and with her nerves frayed, she weaved through the room, moving past magnates and philanthropists. It was a world far removed from hers, a world of wealth, muted laughter, and champagne glasses clinking. That's when she saw him for the first time. Alexander Grant. He stood there, surrounded by people, yet clearly isolated. A man in his early 30s, tall, with cold, ice-like eyes and a demeanor that radiated power. Alexander was infamous as one of the wealthiest and most ruthless men in the country. His fortune was as legendary as his reputation for caring about no one but himself. Mary hesitated. He was the last person she imagined approaching, but she had no choice. With her heart pounding, she crossed the room and stopped in front of him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, she considered turning back, but then her mother's face flashed in her mind, and she found her courage. "Mr. Grant." Her voice was weak but determined. He raised an eyebrow, looking her up and down. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone as cold as his gaze. I'm Mary Collins. My mother is very sick, and I need help." The words tumbled out quickly, as if she feared he'd turn and walk away. Alexander narrowed his eyes. He was used to people asking for money, but something about the way Mary spoke intrigued him. There was a raw desperation in her, a sincerity he didn't often see. "And why should I help you?" He tilted his head, studying her as if she were a puzzle to be solved. Mary swallowed hard. She had no answer except the truth. "Because I have no one else to turn to." Her voice cracked, and tears threatened to fall. "I'll do anything. Anything I can." A heavy silence hung between them. Alexander scrutinized her for a moment before a small, humorless smile tugged at his lips. "Anything?" he repeated, his words laced with implications. Mary felt the weight of his words but didn't flinch. Yes, she was willing to give up everything for her mother, even if it meant crossing a line she'd never imagined. Alexander stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "I can pay for your mother's treatment, all of it, but I want something in return." Mary's heart stopped. She knew what he wanted before he even said it. It was in his eyes, in the tone of his voice. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but the image of Grace, fragile and bedridden, kept her rooted in place. "I want you. One night with me." Alexander's voice was a challenge, a test. Mary was silent, her mind racing. What he was asking for was unthinkable, but her mother needed her. With tears streaming down her face, Mary finally nodded. "I accept." The night was set. What was supposed to be a cold, transactional exchange would become the beginning of something much deeper and far more dangerous. If you've read this far, Let's play a game. Comment passion below. Only those who made it here will understand. Let's keep going. Night came faster than Mary had expected. She had spent the entire day by her mother's side at the hospital, holding Grace's hand as the woman slept peacefully, unaware of the sacrifice her daughter was about to make for her. When the clock struck 7 p.m., Mary stood up, wiped away a stubborn tear, and walked out without looking back. It felt as if, by leaving that room, she was abandoning the version of herself she once knew. Alexander had sent a sleek black car to pick her up. The driver, polite and formal, didn't utter a word as she settled into the back seat. The silence inside the car was almost deafening, and Mary found herself trembling. Not from the cold, but from the fear of what lay ahead. Every mile that distanced her from her modest home brought her closer to an unfamiliar world where she would become nothing more than a pawn in the game of a man who seemed impenetrable. When the car finally stopped in front of an imposing mansion, Mary felt the air leave her lungs. Alexander's estate was as intimidating as he was. Tall gates opened automatically, revealing meticulously groomed gardens and a structure that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale, or perhaps a nightmare. Alexander was waiting for her in the grand entrance hall, dressed in an immaculate suit. His icy blue eyes studied Mary as she hesitantly stepped inside, wearing a simple black dress. He noticed the nervous way she clutched her purse as if it were a shield. "You're on time. I like that," he said, his voice cold but carrying a hint of satisfaction. Mary didn't respond, lowering her gaze as she tried to suppress the tidal wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Alexander led her to a spacious room adorned with sophisticated furniture and soft lighting. He poured a glass of wine and offered it to her, but Mary shook her head in refusal. "You don't have to be afraid of me, Mary." Alexander broke the silence, leaning against the counter with the glass in hand. "This is just a transaction. Nothing more." His words were meant to reassure her, but they did the opposite. The thought of being reduced to a deal made her feel small, almost invisible. But she reminded herself why she was here, her mother. Everything was for Grace. Alexander noticed the tension in Mary's face, and for the first time, something inside him wavered. He was known for his coldness, for never caring about anyone but himself, yet something about Mary unsettled him. Perhaps it was her courage in standing before him, despite knowing what he was capable of. "If you don't want to go through with this, you can leave," he said, his tone softer. "I won't force you." Mary looked up at him, startled by the offer. For a moment, she considered running, but then her mother's image flashed in her mind. Frail and fighting for her life, she had no choice. "No," she said firmly, despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm here to honor my part of the deal." Alexander was silent for a moment before nodding and extending his hand to her. Hesitantly, Mary took it, letting him guide her to another floor of the mansion. The bedroom was luxurious, with glass walls that offered a stunning view of the illuminated city below. Mary's heart raced as Alexander closed the door behind them. He observed her for a moment before stepping closer, but not in the way she expected. Instead, he stopped a few steps away and studied her as if trying to understand something even he couldn't explain. "You're different," he said suddenly, his voice soft. "Different how?" Mary asked, surprised by the casual tone of his remark. "Every woman I've met before wanted my money or what I could offer. You're here for something greater. That intrigues me." Mary didn't know how to respond. She didn't want his pity, but she also didn't know what he expected from her. Before she could say anything, Alexander stepped back and picked up a silk robe from a chair. "Go take a bath," he instructed, handing her the robe. "Relax. Tonight won't be what you think." Confused but relieved, Mary went to the lavish bathroom, where a tub was already filled with warm water and fragrant bubbles. As she undressed and stepped into the water, she tried to make sense of Alexander's words. Was he really as cold as he seemed, or was there more beneath his facade? When she returned to the bedroom wrapped in the robe, Alexander was sitting on a sofa with an open bottle of wine beside him. He looked at her, and for a moment, she saw something in his eyes she couldn't decipher. Vulnerability, perhaps? No, that seemed impossible. "You should stay here tonight," he said calmly, surprising her yet again. "You don't need to do anything. Just sleep." Mary was stunned. This wasn't part of the deal. What was he trying to prove? Yet the exhaustion and tension from the day made her accept. She lay down on the plush bed, though sleep didn't come easily. Alexander's presence in the room was intimidating, yet strangely comforting. The next morning, Mary woke up alone. An envelope sat on the bedside table with a handwritten note from Alexander. "The payment has been sent. I hope your mother gets better." Mary felt a mix of relief and confusion. Alexander was nothing like she had imagined, but for now that didn't matter. Her mother had a chance, and that was all she cared about. In his living room, Alexander stared out the window as the same car that had brought Mary now drove her away. For the first time in years, he felt an unsettling emptiness after someone's departure. The sound of the coffee machine filled Mary's small apartment as she, exhausted, tried to stay awake after another night at the hospital with her mother. The news that Grace's treatment had begun gave Mary hope, but the weight of what she had sacrificed still hung over her like a shadow. Alexander Grant wasn't just any man. He was an enigma, a danger, and now an unshakable part of her story, a part she wished she could forget. Days turned into weeks, and Mary returned to her routine of studying and working. Alexander seemed like a closed chapter until he unexpectedly reappeared. It was a sunny afternoon when Mary stepped out of the hospital to grab a coffee from the corner shop. As she stood in line, she felt a piercing gaze. When she turned, there he was, Alexander Grant, leaning against a sleek black sports car, his expression as serious as ever, making her feel as though he could see right through her. "Mary," he called, his voice firm but restrained. She hesitated before responding. "What are you doing here?" Alexander gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "We need to talk." "We have nothing to talk about," Mary replied, her voice steady, though nerves bubbled beneath the surface. She had no intention of returning to that world, especially now that her mother was improving. "Please." It was the first time he had used the word with her, and it caught her off guard. Alexander Grant didn't seem like the type to ask for anything. He simply took. Not wanting to make a scene, Mary reluctantly agreed. They walked to a nearby cafe, where Alexander looked out of place among the simple decor. He ordered an espresso while Mary sat across from him, her arms crossed, waiting for an explanation. "How's your mother?" he began, his tone genuinely curious. "Better. Thanks to you," Mary replied cautiously, unsure of his intentions. Alexander nodded, staring at the coffee cup in front of him. "I'm glad to hear that." An uncomfortable silence hung between them before he continued. "I need your help," he said, catching Mary completely off guard. "My help?" She frowned. "With what?" "There are people trying to get to me," Alexander said, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "And they're using you as leverage." Mary's heart nearly stopped. "What are you talking about? After we met, I noticed I was being followed. I've received veiled threats. And recently, your name came up in an anonymous note. They know about you, Mary." His expression was tense, but there was an edge of concern in his voice that scared her even more. "That doesn't make sense." "I'm nobody," Mary protested, though her voice wavered. "You're somebody now, at least to me," Alexander said with unsettling intensity. "And that's enough to make you a target." Mary struggled to process what he was saying. Alexander was a powerful man, surrounded by potential enemies, and now she was caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. "What do you want me to do?" she finally asked, knowing she had no choice but to trust him, however reluctantly. "I want you to stay close to me," Alexander said, his tone firm. "At least until I figure out who's behind this." "Stay close to you?" Mary almost laughed in disbelief. "You want me to step back into your world? After everything? I don't want anything to happen to you." Alexander's voice softened, and Mary realized he genuinely believed what he was saying. Reluctantly, Mary agreed. She knew refusing could be dangerous not just for her but for her mother as well. Alexander arranged for her and Grace to stay in a secure house in a luxury neighborhood, guarded by discreet security. Mary hated relying on him, but she had no other choice. Meanwhile, Alexander worked tirelessly to uncover who was behind the threats. He began to notice strange patterns: suspicious financial transactions, anonymous calls, and a black car frequently parked near his mansion. He knew he was dealing with someone intelligent, someone who understood his vulnerabilities. But what Alexander didn't expect was the growing impact Mary had on his life. Even amid the chaos, he found himself thinking about her more than he cared to admit. There was something about her strength, her honesty, the way she made him feel human. On the other side, Mary also began to see Alexander differently. He wasn't just the cold, calculating man she had met on that fateful night. There were moments of kindness, of vulnerability, that made him seem more real. But that didn't lessen the danger surrounding him. One night, as Alexander reviewed documents in his mansion, Mary walked in. She was tired of being on the sidelines, waiting for him to fix everything. "I want to help," she said, crossing her arms. Alexander looked up, surprised. "I don't want you involved any more than you already are." "I'm already involved, Alexander," Mary replied, her voice firm. "Whoever these people are, they're coming after me because of you. I have a right to know what's going on." Alexander was silent for a moment before finally relenting. "Fine," he said, "but I promise I won't let anything happen to you." As Mary and Alexander worked together to unravel the mystery, a gunshot shattered the glass window of the mansion, cutting their conversation short. Both dropped to the floor as the screech of tires outside signaled that the danger was far closer than they had imagined. The sound of shattered glass still echoed in Mary's mind as she crouched behind the sofa, trying to steady her ragged breathing. The bullet had been direct and precise, piercing through the main window of the mansion. Alexander was beside her, as calm as one could be in such a situation. His piercing blue eyes burned with determination as he glanced at her. "It's going to be okay," he said, though he knew it was far from true. "This is your idea of okay?" Mary whispered, panic evident in her voice. "I was almost shot, Alexander." Before he could respond, 2 security guards rushed into the room, guns drawn, ready to act. Alexander ordered them to secure the perimeter, though he already knew the shooter was long gone. This wasn't just an attack. It was a warning, a message received loud and clear. We need to get somewhere safer. Alexander helped Mary to her feet, his grip firm on her arm. I can't risk anything happening to you. Mary wanted to argue, but terror silenced her. They were escorted to the mansion's underground safe room, a fortified space equipped with everything they needed. While Alexander made calls and coordinated his security team, Mary sat on a leather sofa, struggling to process it all. She felt trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. But what terrified her more than the bullets or the threats was the realization dawning upon her. She was falling for Alexander. In the days that followed, Mary and Alexander were inseparable, not only for safety but because the tension between them was undeniable. Mary began to see a side of Alexander he rarely revealed: his vulnerability. During quiet conversations, he opened up about his past. An abusive father, the loss of his mother at a young age, and betrayals by people he once trusted. These experiences had shaped the cold, calculating man he was today. It's hard to trust anyone when all you've known is disappointment, Alexander admitted one evening as they sat on a secluded balcony. But do you trust me? Mary asked, surprised by her own boldness. Alexander looked at her, his usually hard features softening. I think I do, and that scares me more than anything. Mary didn't know how to respond. Conflicting emotions churned in her heart. Alexander was dangerous, but there was something about him that made her want to stay, something that made her believe he could be more than the cold exterior he showed the world. Meanwhile, the threats continued. Alexander received another anonymous note, this time with a photo of Mary and Grace leaving the hospital. It infuriated him. Whoever was behind this was getting too close, and he needed to put an end to it before someone got hurt. But what troubled him even more were his feelings for Mary. He knew she didn't belong in his world, a world of wealth, power, and constant danger. Yet he couldn't let her go. She was a force that disarmed him, making him want to be better. One night, while poring over documents to piece together who was behind the threats, Mary asked him, "Have you ever thought about leaving all this behind? Starting over?" Alexander chuckled, but it was a hollow sound. "It's not that simple, Mary. My world doesn't work that way. Honestly, I don't even know who I'd be without it." "Maybe you're more than you think you are," Mary said softly, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, everything changed. Alexander leaned in and kissed her, his hand gently caressing her face. Mary kissed him back, forgetting for a brief moment all the dangers, all the barriers between them. The kiss was intense, charged with repressed passion and emotions neither could deny any longer. When they finally broke apart, Alexander looked at her seriously. "You have no idea what you're doing to me, Mary," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I can't let you go." In the days that followed, Mary and Alexander worked side by side to unravel the mystery of the threats. Mary displayed a bravery Alexander hadn't expected, helping him connect the dots from the clues they had. They discovered the culprit was tied to a rival company that had lost a significant contract to Alexander years earlier. But it went deeper than business. This was personal. Someone was using the opportunity to settle an old score. Their investigation led to a name: Vincent Harper, a former business partner of Alexander's who had been ousted for embezzlement. Harper had every reason to hate Alexander and the connections to carry out his threats. As Alexander prepared to confront Harper, Mary received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper. "If you want to save your mother, leave the safe house right now, or it'll be too late." Mary hung up, terrified. She knew it was a trap, but she couldn't take the risk. Without telling Alexander, she slipped out into the night. If you've read this far, let's play a game. Comment glass below. Only those who made it here will understand. Now let's continue the story. Mary couldn't shake the words from the call she had received. If you want to save your mother, leave the safe house right now, or it will be too late. The voice on the other end had been calm, yet laden with sinister intent. The threat was clear, and Mary couldn't ignore the fear gripping her heart. Without alerting Alexander or the security team assigned to protect her, Mary silently left the safe house. Even knowing it could be a trap, her fear for her mother's safety overpowered her logic. She followed the instructions sent to her phone, leading her to an isolated warehouse on the outskirts of the city. When she arrived, the setting was eerie and desolate. The abandoned structure felt like the backdrop of a nightmare, with broken windows and the echo of distant footsteps. Hesitantly, Mary stepped inside, calling out into the void. "I'm here!" Her voice broke the silence, but the emptiness seemed to swallow the sound. Suddenly, harsh lights flickered on, momentarily blinding her. When her vision adjusted, she saw a man standing in the center of the warehouse. He wore a cold smile, the expression of someone who relished being in control. It was Vincent Harper, a name unfamiliar to Mary, though he clearly knew much about her. "At last," he said, his voice steady and laced with mockery. "So, you're the girl who's become Alexander Grant's weakness." Before Mary could react, two men emerged from the shadows, grabbing her arms. She struggled to break free, but it was useless. Panic surged through her as Harper watched, his satisfaction evident. "Alexander thinks he can control everything and everyone. He made a mistake by caring for someone like you. Now he's going to learn a lesson." Back at the mansion, Alexander sensed something was wrong. Reviewing the security footage, he saw Mary leaving the premises alone. A sinking feeling hit him, and he immediately tracked her phone. When her location became clear, it was obvious she had been lured into a trap. Alexander quickly assembled his security team and headed to the warehouse. He knew Harper was a dangerous and calculating man, but he also knew he couldn't leave Mary to face him alone. To Alexander, Mary wasn't just someone he had helped. She was the only person who had broken through his emotional walls in years. When he arrived at the warehouse, Alexander found Mary surrounded. Harper stood close to her, wearing a smug, triumphant grin. Alexander kept his composure, though his mind raced with strategies to get her out safely. "Harper, end this now," Alexander said, his voice steady but authoritative. "It doesn't have to go any further." Harper chuckled dryly, his gaze fixed on Alexander. "You took everything from me. Now it's my turn to make you lose what matters." As Harper focused on Alexander, Mary saw her chance. In a quick, decisive move, she destabilized one of the men holding her, creating a momentary distraction. Alexander seized the opportunity, surging forward to neutralize the threat. Within seconds, his security team subdued Harper's men, securing the area. With the situation under control, Alexander rushed to Mary, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "You're safe now," he said, his voice filled with both relief and intensity. Mary nodded, but the fear and adrenaline were still visible in her expression. The ordeal had been traumatic, and she realized she couldn't keep living in Alexander's dangerous world. The next morning, Mary made the difficult decision to leave. She knew Alexander would do anything to protect her, but staying with him meant putting her mother, and herself in constant danger. She left a letter on his bedside table, her words heartfelt yet painful. "Alexander, you came into my life in a way I never expected. But now I see that I don't belong in your world. Thank you for everything you've done for me and my mother. I hope you find what you're looking for, but I need to move forward. Goodbye." When Alexander found the letter, he was devastated. For the first time, he felt powerless. All the influence and wealth he had seemed meaningless against the pain of losing someone who had become so important to him. As Alexander struggles to come to terms with Mary's departure, he uncovers evidence that Harper wasn't acting alone. There's a more powerful and dangerous force behind the attacks, one that hasn't given up on targeting him through Mary. Alexander couldn't get Mary out of his mind. Her letter sat on his desk, read and reread countless times. He knew she had left out of fear, not a lack of feelings. Yet, the emptiness her absence left was deeper than any wound he had ever experienced. His determination to protect her, however, had only grown stronger, especially after uncovering something that changed everything. As he combed through documents tied to Harper's dealings, Alexander found a detail he had missed. Harper wasn't acting alone. The suspicious transactions and intercepted messages pointed to a more powerful figure pulling the strings, someone with the resources to orchestrate a far-reaching plan. And whoever they were, they weren't done yet. That same day, Alexander received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was calm but laden with menace. "You've lost Mary, but that doesn't mean she's safe. Don't forget that." Alexander hung up immediately, a cold fury building within him. He knew he needed to act fast. Mary was alone and vulnerable, and whoever was truly behind this was still after her. Mary, meanwhile, was trying to rebuild her life. She had rented a small apartment in a neighboring city, far from anything that reminded her of Alexander. Grace was recovering well, and that was what mattered most. Yet Mary couldn't shake the feeling that danger still loomed. She frequently glanced over her shoulder, sensing eyes on her even when she was alone. One night, after returning from a hospital visit, Mary found an anonymous letter taped to her apartment door. Trembling, she opened the envelope. The note bore a single chilling sentence: "You can't escape Alexander's fate." Fear gripped her once more. She picked up her phone, debating whether to call Alexander, but hesitated. Part of her wanted to believe he was no longer a part of her life, yet another part knew he was the only one who could truly protect her. Alexander traced the anonymous messages and calls to a commercial building in New York owned by someone once close to his family. He immediately recognized the culprit, Gerald Crane, a former business partner ousted years ago for corrupt practices. Crane had the resources and the vendetta to wage this campaign against Alexander, and using Mary as leverage fit his twisted sense of revenge. Alexander decided it was time to put an end to it. Gathering his team, Alexander prepared for a confrontation. He knew it would be dangerous, but protecting Mary was worth any risk. Before heading out, he left her a brief message. "I'm putting an end to this once and for all. Don't trust anyone until you hear from me." Mary read the message with a mix of relief and worry. She wanted to believe Alexander could resolve everything, but the anonymous note still weighed heavily on her. Acting on impulse, she decided to go to him. If he was risking everything for her, she couldn't just sit idly by. At the building where Crane was hiding, the final confrontation began. Alexander and his team entered, but Crane had anticipated them. He revealed that his grudge against Alexander wasn't just business, it was personal. He wanted to destroy everything Alexander cared about to prove himself victorious. For Crane, Mary was just the beginning. When Mary arrived, she found Alexander surrounded but fiercely holding his ground. She shouted his name, drawing everyone's attention. For a brief moment, chaos erupted. It was all Alexander needed to turn the tide. With precision and strategy, he neutralized Crane's operation and secured the situation. When it was over, Alexander turned to Mary, his eyes filled with emotion. "I told you not to come," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "I couldn't stay away," Mary replied with equal intensity. "Not after everything." In the days that followed, Crane was arrested, and the immediate danger seemed to have passed. But the events had left their mark. Alexander, once so certain he needed no one, realized Mary was the only person he truly wanted by his side. And Mary, despite her fear, understood she was stronger than ever because her love for Alexander was greater than any threat. In a touching final scene, Alexander makes a heartfelt promise to Mary. He's willing to change, to leave behind the dangerous world he had built, and to create a safe life by her side. Mary's life finally seemed to be falling into place. With Gerald Crane behind bars and his operation dismantled, the danger that once loomed over her had vanished. Her mother, Grace, was recovering well and slowly regaining her independence. Yet, despite the apparent calm, Mary couldn't ignore the emptiness Alexander's absence left behind. She didn't know how to rebuild her life without him. Despite the dangers and challenges they had faced together, he had become the most important person in her life. But Mary also knew she needed a safe, stable life, something Alexander hadn't been able to offer. On the other side, Alexander was on his own journey of transformation. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning the world he had built. He had always believed power and control were everything, but Mary had shown him there was more to life, something meaningful and real. Determined to change, he began dismantling his most dangerous ventures, cutting ties with people and practices that could put Mary at risk again. One quiet afternoon, Mary received an unexpected message. It was from Alexander. "Meet me at the park where everything began for you." She instantly knew what he meant. The small park near the hospital where she had spent so many afternoons reflecting on her life before she met him. When Mary arrived, she found Alexander waiting under a large tree, his hands in his pockets and an expression of nervous determination on his face. He looked different, lighter somehow, though still very much the man who had changed her life in so many unexpected ways. "I needed to see you," Alexander said, breaking the silence. "I needed to show you I'm not the man you met that night." Mary hesitated, trying to decipher his words. "I've left it all behind," he continued. "The businesses, the risks, the people from that world. There's only one thing that matters to me now. You." Mary felt his words crash over her like a wave. She had always known Alexander was capable of change, but hearing it directly from him moved her deeply. "It's not just about what you've left behind, Alexander," she replied softly. "It's about who you want to be moving forward." Alexander smiled a rare, genuine smile. He stepped closer and took Mary's hands in his. "I want to be the man who deserves you," he said. "I want a life with you. No dangers, no fears. I want to build something real." Tears welled in Mary's eyes. For the first time, she felt a future with Alexander was truly possible. "Then we're in this together," she said, smiling through her tears. In the months that followed, Alexander and Mary began a new life together. Alexander shifted his focus to safer, more altruistic endeavors, including founding an organization to help people in situations like Mary and Grace's. He also began cherishing the simpler things in life, something Mary had taught him to value. Grace, now fully recovered, became a strong supporter of their relationship. She saw the genuine love between them and knew her daughter was happy. One magical evening under the stars, Alexander proposed to Mary. He chose the garden of the foundation he had built in honor of the people who had inspired him to change. Mary accepted with an emotional smile, and the kiss they shared was a promise of a future filled with love and hope. A year later, Mary and Alexander were married, living in a cozy lakeside home far from the chaos and complications of the past. The foundation flourished, and the two found a balance between their worlds. Grace often visited, filling their home with laughter and reminding them how life could change for the better, even in the darkest moments. As they watched the sunset together one evening, Alexander held Mary's hand and said, "I used to think power was everything, but then I met you, and now I understand that true power lies in love." Mary smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. They had faced challenges that nearly tore them apart, but now they were together, ready for whatever the future might bring. For the first time in a long time, they both felt they were exactly where they were meant to be. So, what did you think of this emotional ending? Do you believe love can truly change someone the way it did for Alexander? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on more intense, heartfelt stories with happy endings. See you next time.